This village is incredible.
The wind never stopped on that ridge above Pine Hollow.
A perfect
It came down from the
Couldn't agree
mountains in
more.
long, cold breaths, rattling the pine branches and whistling through the tall grass, like it was trying to warn anyone foolish enough to live there. Most folks built their homes closer to town, tucked into the trees for shelter, but Caleb and his little sister Anna lived higher up where the land sloped toward the sky and winter always arrived first. They had no choice, really. After their parents died 2 winters earlier, the small cabin they'd been renting near town was taken back by the owner. There was no money left for another place. The ridge belonged to no one, and it was far enough from town that nobody argued when a 16-year-old boy and his 9-year-old sister claimed it. What Caleb built there didn't look like a normal house. It was 2 small buildings instead of one, standing side by side like awkward twins. One was a living house with a stone fireplace and 2 narrow windows. The other was a low, sturdy structure meant for animals and food storage. Between them ran a short, enclosed hallway made of thick planks and packed with straw for insulation. From a distance, the whole thing looked stitched together, as if someone had tried to turn a barn and a cabin into a single creature. People noticed. "Why don't you just build one proper house?" old Mr. Barnes asked one afternoon, as Caleb hauled boards up from town in a borrowed wagon. Caleb didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road and the reins in his hands. Mr. Barnes laughed. "Boy's building a house for goats and a barn for himself." By the time the walls went up, the jokes had names. Some called it the split shack. Others called it the kid's 2-headed cabin. A few said it looked like something made by someone who didn't know where people were supposed to sleep and where animals were supposed to go. Anna heard those words more than Caleb did. She heard them when she carried nails in her coat pockets or helped him buy flour and lamp oil in town. Her shoulders always curled inward when people stared. "Do they think it's ugly?" she asked one night as they lay on their thin mattresses in the unfinished living house. Caleb poked at the fire with a stick. "They think it's strange." "Is strange bad?" He thought about that. Not always. Anna was small for her age, with hair the color of dry wheat and eyes that never stopped watching. She had learned to trust her brother the way other kids trusted grown-ups, but even trust had limits when the wind moaned outside and the walls still smelled like fresh-cut pine. Caleb worked like someone running out of time. He rose before sunrise, his hands already sore from the day before. He stacked stones for the fireplace. He packed mud into the cracks between the boards. He lined the hallway between the 2 buildings with hay and old blankets he'd begged from town. The animal house came first. It had low ceilings to hold warmth and thick walls to block the wind. By early fall, he had 2 goats, a few chickens, and a pile of dried grass stacked higher than Anna's head. The smell of hay and animals filled that side of the house, sharp and alive. The living house came next. He built the fireplace himself, stone by stone, using what he remembered from watching his father years ago. The chimney rose straight and solid, like a promise. To everyone else, it looked backward. Why make a separate building just for animals? Why connect them with a hallway instead of a door outside? Why waste precious wood on 2 roofs instead of one? Caleb never explained. Not to Mr. Barnes, not to the storekeeper, not to the men who leaned on the fence and watched him work like he was some kind of show. But he explained to Anna. One afternoon when the sun was already low and the air smelled like frost, she followed him into the animal house. The goats bleated softly, and the chickens shuffled in their corner. "Why do they have to be so close to us?" she asked. "Don't people usually keep animals far away?" Caleb crouched and ran his hand through the hay. "Animals make heat. Their bodies do it all the time." Anna wrinkled her nose. "They smell." "They do, but they're warm." He knocked on the wooden wall between the 2 buildings. "That wall is thick. The hallway keeps the wind out. The heat moves through the wood." She frowned at trying to picture it. "So, the goats help us not freeze?" "In a way," he said, "and we don't have to go outside to feed them when the snow comes." Anna's eyes widened. "You think it will be that bad?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He watched the sky through the narrow window. It had turned a pale, heavy gray, the kind that sat low on the mountains. "I don't think," he said finally. "I remember." He remembered the winter their parents didn't come home from town. The storm that arrived too fast, the way the cold got inside the house and stayed, the way the chimney smoked wrong and the air turned bitter. He remembered how quiet everything had become. That was why the house had 2 parts. That was why the hallway existed. That was why he worked even when his arms shook and his hands bled. By the time the first real snow fell, the house was finished. Inside, it felt different from any place they had lived before. The living house smelled like wood smoke and dry pine. The animal house smelled like hay and warm bodies. And the hallway between them felt like the spine of something alive, carrying warmth back and forth. Anna liked to stand in the doorway between the two and feel the change in the air. "It's like walking between seasons," she said once. Caleb smiled at that. In town, people kept laughing. "They won't last one storm up there," someone said at the general store. "Kid built a house like a puzzle," another added. "Snow will eat it alive." Caleb heard those words, but they no longer sank into him the way they had before. Every night he checked the roof. He checked the chimney. He checked the hallway door. Every night he listened to the goats breathing and the fire snapping. One evening, as the wind grew louder, Anna sat close to him by the hearth. "Caleb," she said softly, "what if they're right?" He looked down at her thin face, the way her hands stayed wrapped in her sleeves. "Then we'll learn," he said. "But if they're wrong, we'll still be here." Outside, the first true storm of the season touched the mountains. Snow crept along the ridge like a living thing. And for the first time since their parents were gone, Caleb believed they might be ready. Winter had a way of sneaking up on Pine Hollow. One week the mornings were just cold enough to sting your fingers, and the next, frost clung to every fence post like it had grown there overnight. After the first snow dusted the ridge, people in town went back to their routines. They chopped more firewood. They salted their steps. They talked about how bad last year had been and how this year would probably be the same. Caleb didn't talk much about it, but inside he felt something tightening. Every time the wind rose at night, he remembered another wind from 2 years ago, the one that had carried his parents out of their lives. He had been 14 then, old enough to understand fear, too young to know what to do with it. That winter, his parents had gone into town for supplies. A storm came early, fast and thick, turning the road into a white tunnel. They never made it back. People said they must have taken shelter somewhere and fallen asleep. Others said the cold probably got them before they even knew it was winning. All Caleb knew was that the house they had lived in, one small cabin with thin walls and a crooked chimney, had not been enough. The fire had smoked instead of burned clean. The cold had pressed through the floorboards like a living thing. When neighbors finally came, it was too late. That memory lived in him like a second heartbeat. So when people said, "It'll be a normal winter," Caleb heard something else. "It'll be the same kind of winter that killed your parents." Anna didn't know all of that. Not in words anyway. She had been 7 then, and her memories were broken pieces. Voices, snow in the doorway, the way grown-ups looked when they tried not to cry. Caleb carried the rest of it for both of them. One afternoon, as he tightened the latch on the hallway door between the two houses, Anna stood watching him with her arms wrapped around herself. "You check that door a lot," she said. "It's important." "More important than the front door?" He shook his head. "More important than going outside." She frowned. "Why don't we just go outside like everyone else?" Caleb leaned against the wall, the wood still smelling new. "Because outside is where winter lives." She thought about that. "But winter comes inside too. Only if you let it." That was the heart of it. He didn't believe in fighting winter head-on anymore. He believed in designing around it. He believed in staying one step ahead, the way animals did. That was why the two houses mattered. He showed Anna again how it worked. This time slower, like a lesson instead of an explanation. "The animal house stays warmer because their bodies make heat," he said. "The walls trap it. The hallway traps it. When the wind hits one side, the other side stays calmer." "And the food, Shirash?" she asked. "Dry and close. If the snow blocks the door, we don't have to dig our way to the barn." She nodded, serious now. "So we don't get stuck. So we don't get trapped," he corrected gently. In town, nobody built like that. They trusted thick walls and good luck. Their homes were low and wide, with doors that opened straight into the weather. Their barns stood apart, dark and cold, waiting to be shoveled out after every storm. Caleb noticed things other people didn't. He noticed how the creek froze in layers instead of all at once. He noticed how the wind slid down the mountain and settled in the valley at night. He noticed how the birds disappeared weeks earlier than usual. One evening, he stood outside the animal house with Anna while they scattered grain for the chickens. "Where do you think the deer go?" she asked. "Lower ground, trees, anywhere the wind can't find them." She looked up the ridge. "But we're higher." "We are," he said. "That's why the house has to be smarter." The townspeople saw none of this. They saw a boy who had built 2 small houses instead of one big one. They saw straw packed into walls and a hallway where a porch should be. They saw wasted effort. They didn't see what Caleb saw, a way to stay alive without stepping into the storm. As the weeks passed, the sky grew heavier. The clouds didn't drift anymore. They stacked up like they were waiting their turn. The wind carried a sharper edge, cutting through clothes and into bone. Caleb began to change how they lived. He moved most of their food into the animal house. Flour, dried beans, smoked meat wrapped in cloth. He hung sacks from beams to keep them off the floor. He lined the hallway with more blankets and nailed boards over the cracks. Anna helped without complaining, though she asked questions. "Are we moving in there?" she said, pointing at the animal house. "Not sleeping," he said. "Just staying close." "It smells." "Smells like warm," he answered. One night, while the fire burned low, Anna asked the question he had been waiting for. "Are you scared?" He stared into the flames. "Yes." She moved closer. "Of what?" "Of being wrong," he said, "and of being right." She didn't understand that, but she understood his voice. She slipped her hand into his sleeve and held on. In town, people joked louder as winter crept closer. They always did. It made the cold feel smaller. "Boy's house will fall apart before Christmas," someone said. "Two roofs just mean twice the snow," another replied. Caleb heard it when he came down for supplies. He felt it when eyes followed him back to his wagon. But the words didn't land the same way anymore. They slid off him like snow off a steep roof. He had something they didn't, a memory that wouldn't let him pretend. Late one afternoon, as the sun dropped behind the mountains too fast, Anna stood in the doorway between the two houses again. "It's warmer here," she said quietly. "That's the point." She smiled a little. "Then maybe strange is good." Caleb laughed for the first time in days. It was a short sound, but real. That night, the wind rose and didn't fall again. It pressed against the walls, testing them. The goats shifted in their pen. The fire crackled and held. Caleb lay awake, listening. The house didn't creak the way the old cabin had. It didn't sigh like it was tired. It stood still, solid, divided but connected. Two halves working as one. For the first time since their parents were gone, Caleb felt something close to confidence. Not hope. Hope felt too soft. This was something harder. Preparation. The wind changed first. Caleb noticed it one morning when he stepped outside with a bucket for water. It wasn't just cold anymore. It felt heavy, like it was carrying something with it. The air pressed against his face instead of slipping past, and when he breathed in, it tasted sharp, almost metallic. He stood there longer than he should have, watching the trees along the ridge. Their branches bent in the same direction, stiff and obedient, like they already knew what was coming. Inside, Anna was tying her boots. "Why are you looking at the trees like that?" she asked. "They're pointing one," he said. "Pointing where?" "Downhill, same as the clouds." She frowned. "Clouds don't point." "They do when they're full," he said. The sky had turned a flat, bruised gray, the kind that didn't move much. It didn't feel like weather passing through. It felt like weather settling in. Down in Pine Hollow, people said it was just an early cold snap. They'd seen worse. They always said that. But the animals said something else. The birds disappeared first. Not all at once, just fewer each day until the fence posts were empty. Then the deer stopped coming to the edge of the trees. Even the coyotes went quiet. Their night calls cut short like someone had closed a door. Caleb paid attention to that. Animals didn't joke about weather. By the second week of December, the creek that ran below the ridge froze solid in a single night. Not a thin skin of ice. Solid, white, and thick enough that he could stand on it without hearing a crack. That made his stomach tighten. He began to change their routine. Every morning he checked the roof of both houses. He swept away any snow before it had time to settle. He reinforced the door to the hallway between the buildings with another plank and packed more straw into the gaps. Anna followed him with nails and a hammer, her breath fogging in the air. "Are we building again?" she asked. "We're finishing here." He carries on. "Finishing what?" "The winter." She laughed, but it came out thin. They moved more supplies into the animal house. Sacks of flour, jars of dried apples, bundles of firewood stacked high against the inner wall. Caleb hung them from beams where he could, keeping them off the floor in case melting snow found its way inside. The goats didn't like being inside all day, but they stayed close to the feed and the warmth. Their bodies filled the small space with steady movement and sound. The chickens roosted higher than usual, feathers puffed tight against the cold. One evening, Anna wrinkled her nose as she stepped into the hallway. "It smells stronger," she said. "That's good," Caleb replied. "It means the air isn't getting out." She glanced back toward the door of the living house. "And the cold? It stays outside." In town, people were doing what they always did. They chopped wood until their arms ached. They patched windows with old cloth. They laughed about how the mountains like to scare folks early every year. "You worry too much, Caleb," the storekeeper said when he bought extra lamp oil. "Snow comes, snow goes." Caleb didn't argue. He had learned that explanations only made people dig in deeper. But he watched their houses as he passed. Low roofs, single doors, chimneys already blackened from smoke. He imagined what would happen if snow piled up faster than they could shovel. That thought stayed with him. Back on the ridge, the wind howled through the night like it was practicing. Caleb lay awake, counting its rhythms. Anna slept curled under two blankets, one arm thrown over her head like she could block the sound. Sometime near dawn, he heard something new. A low, constant hiss like sand pouring onto wood. Snow, not flakes drifting down gently, but snow driven sideways by the wind, slapping against the walls of the animal house and piling up against the door. By morning, the ground was already hidden. Anna stood at the window and pressed her nose to the glass. "It's all white." Caleb opened the door just long enough to look out. The ridge had lost its shape. The trail to town was gone, erased in a single night. The trees stood half-buried, their lower branches swallowed whole. This wasn't a storm passing through. This was something arriving. He shut the door and latched it tight. "All right," he said. "We start now." "Start what?" "Staying inside." They fed the animals from the stacked hay and grain. They cooked on the hearth and kept the fire steady. Not too big, not too small. Caleb checked the hallway every hour, feeling the walls with his hands. Warm. Still warm. The sky never really brightened that day. It stayed the color of ash, and the wind didn't rest. Snow climbed up the side of the living house and pressed against the windows like it was curious. By nightfall, the door to the animal house wouldn't open outward anymore. "That's bad, isn't it?" Anna asked. "It's expected," he said, though his chest felt tight. "That's why we don't use that door now." They used the hallway only. From house to house, warmth traveling with them like a shared breath. Down in Pine Hollow, chimneys disappeared under drifts. Doors vanished behind walls of snow. People who tried to shovel found themselves digging straight into a white wall that didn't move. But up on the ridge, Caleb watched it happen from inside. The wind roared, the snow stacked. The world outside the windows rose higher and higher until the glass no longer showed trees, only white. The animals grew restless. The goats shifted and stamped. The chickens fluttered and settled again. Anna sat close to Caleb on the floor by the hearth. "Is it going to stop?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "When?" "I don't know." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Do you think anyone else is ready?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He pictured the houses in town, the way their doors opened straight into the wind, the way their barns stood apart, cold and dark, the way people laughed when he talked about heat and trapped air. "No," he said finally, "I don't think they are." Outside, the sound of the storm deepened. It wasn't just wind anymore. It was weight. The kind of sound snow makes when it falls without stopping, when it piles on itself, when it presses down on roofs and fences and lives. Anna hugged her knees. "Then why are we?" Caleb looked at the wall between the two houses, the thick boards, the straw packed tight, the place where warmth moved through wood. "Because we didn't build for normal," he said. "We built for this." She leaned her head against his shoulder. That night, the ridge vanished completely. The house became an island buried in white. Two small buildings, holding together through a narrow spine of wood and warmth. Caleb lay awake again, listening to the storm work on the walls. And far below them, Pine Hollow went silent. By the third day, the storm had erased everything Caleb knew. There was no ridge anymore. No trail. No trees standing tall enough to look like trees. The world outside the windows had turned into a smooth, endless wall of white that pressed so close it felt like the house was breathing it in. Snow didn't fall anymore. It stacked. It packed itself against the living house first, climbing up the walls until the lower window disappeared. Then it crept toward the roof, sealing the edges where wood met sky. When the wind shifted, it shoved snow into every corner, every seam, every weak place it could find. Inside the house, time lost its shape. Morning and night blended together in the gray light that filtered through the upper window. The fire became their clock. When it burned low, Caleb fed it. When it snapped loud, he let it rest. Anna stayed close to the animals more than she ever had before. She liked the sound of the goats chewing and the steady warmth of their bodies. It made the storm feel farther away. "Do you think we're underground now?" she asked once, standing in the hallway and staring at the door that led outside. "Not yet," Caleb said, "but close." The animal house had become their anchor. The low ceiling trapped heat, and the thick walls held it like a secret. Even when the fire softened, the air never dropped into the biting cold that lived beyond the boards. Caleb kept checking the same three things: the chimney, the hallway door, and the roof beam that ran across the living house. The chimney worried him the most. He climbed up onto the hearth and peered into it with a lantern. Smoke still rose, thin and clean. The draft held. That was good. Down in Pine Hollow, he knew that wasn't true. Houses there were built to breathe. Their chimneys were exposed, their roofs low. As snow buried them, smoke had nowhere to go. Air turned thick. Fires died or smoldered wrong. Caleb pictured it without trying to. Doors sealed by drifts. Windows lost in white. People sitting in dark rooms, waiting for the wind to quiet down. On the fourth day, the storm changed its voice. Instead of howling, it groaned. The sound came from deep inside the snowpack, like something heavy shifting its weight. When it moved, the walls of the animal house shuddered, and the goats stamped in their pen. Anna grabbed Caleb's sleeve. "Is it breaking?" "No," he said, though his heart raced. "It's settling." That was worse in some ways. Settling meant weight. By evening, the lower door to the living house wouldn't open at all. Snow had pressed so hard against it that the hinges bowed inward. They stopped trying. The hallway became their only path between the two buildings. The outside no longer mattered. Caleb did the math in his head, again and again. Food, water, firewood, days. They had enough to last a while, if nothing failed. The house had been designed for this, but design only worked if every part did its job. Late that night, when Anna was asleep on a pile of blankets near the hearth, Caleb heard a new sound, a dull thump. It came from the roof of the living house. Then another. Then a slow, stretching creak. He sat up listening. The roof beam groaned like an old man standing from a chair. Snow was piling faster than the roof could shed it. Caleb pulled on his coat and boots and climbed onto the hearth again. He pushed open the upper window and forced it outward. Snow fell in immediately, cold and fine. The world outside was a solid mass. He had built the roof at an angle for a reason. Snow was supposed to slide off, but the wind had turned it into cement. He couldn't go out yet. The storm would tear him apart. So he did the only thing he could. He waited. By morning, the sound of the roof had changed. The beam still creaked, but it held. The animal house stayed warm. The hallway stayed dry. Their strange split home was doing exactly what he'd built it to do. That knowledge didn't bring peace. It brought responsibility. Because the silence from town had become complete. No distant chopping, no smoke lines rising, no sounds carried on the wind. Anna noticed it too. "Why is it so quiet?" she whispered. Caleb didn't answer. On the fifth day, the storm paused for a moment. Not enough to see the sky, but enough for the wind to lose its teeth. Caleb felt it in the walls first. The pressure eased. The house seemed to relax. He stood by the upper window and pushed it open again. Snow fell inward, but less fiercely this time. He climbed up carefully and pushed his head out. There was no town anymore. Pine Hollow had vanished under a single white plain. Only the very tops of the tallest buildings showed through, dark squares in the snow. It looked like the world had been erased and redrawn. Caleb's chest tightened. He knew what that meant. People weren't buried in drifts anymore. They were buried in roofs. He shut the window and leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Anna watched him. "What did you see?" "Nothing," he said. "And that's the problem." She walked over slowly. "Are they?" "I don't know," he said. "But if they are alive, they won't be for long." The house felt suddenly too small. Warmth filled it, but so did the weight of knowing. He had built this place so they wouldn't die like their parents. He hadn't built it to watch others die instead. All day he wrestled with the thought. If he went out, the storm could kill him. The cold could cut through his clothes. The snow could swallow him. If he stayed, the house would keep doing its job. But the town would go silent forever. That night the wind rose again, but weaker than before. Snow still fell, but it felt tired. Caleb sat by the hearth and stared at the fire. Anna sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest. "Are you thinking about going?" she asked. "Yes." She swallowed. "Are you coming back?" "I will try." "That's not the same." He reached over and took her hand. "I know." They sat that way for a long time, listening to the animals breathe and the fire crackle. Outside, Pine Hollow lay buried. Inside, a 16-year-old boy faced a choice no one should have to make. Stay warm, or step into the white and become something more than a survivor. The storm hadn't won yet, but it was waiting. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the wall of the living house, listening to the storm breathe outside. It no longer screamed. It whispered. That was worse. Quiet meant weight had already fallen. Quiet meant the world had settled into a shape that could kill people if no one moved. When the fire burned low, he fed it one last time and stood up. Anna stirred in her blankets. "Is it morning?" "Not really," he said, "but it's time." She pushed herself upright, rubbing her eyes. The animals shifted in the other building, sensing movement. "You're going," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She wrapped her arms around herself. "You said you would try to come back." "I will," he said again. "And I need you to stay here. Keep the fire going. Don't open the doors unless I knock 3 times." "What if you don't knock?" He hesitated. "Then you wait," he said softly. "This house will keep you alive." That wasn't comfort, it was instruction. And she understood the difference. Caleb dressed in layers, every piece of clothing he owned. He tied a rope around his waist and fastened the other end to the heavy beam in the animal house. He wrapped his face in a scarf until only his eyes showed. Anna handed him a bundle. "Blankets," she said, "and bread." He took it and hugged her once, hard. She smelled like smoke and wool and fear. "Don't be brave," she whispered. "Be careful." He nodded. The upper window was their only way out now. He pushed it open with his shoulder, and snow poured in, soft and sharp at the same time. The air outside bit like teeth. Caleb climbed up onto the roof and pulled the rope after him. The world beyond the house had no edges. Everything was white, smooth, and strangely bright under the gray sky. He took one step. The snow held. Another. Still solid. It was packed tight from days of wind and weight. He was standing on what used to be the top of the storm. He moved slowly, keeping the rope taut behind him, walking not on ground but on roofs. The living house roof led to the animal house roof. Beyond that, the ridge dropped into the valley where Pine Hollow used to be. Only the highest points showed now, dark squares and lines in a sea of white. Caleb slid down the slope toward the town, careful with every step. The snow shifted under him, but it didn't break. It felt like walking on a frozen lake. When he reached the first house, he almost missed it. Only the chimney tip was visible, a short black stub sticking out of the snow. He knelt and brushed snow away with his gloved hands. Then he used the shovel he'd strapped to his back. It took time, his arms burned. His breath came out in clouds. When he reached the top of the chimney, he leaned down and shouted, "Ha ha 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 ha. Hello?" "Nothing." He shouted again. A sound came back. Faint, broken, like someone coughing underwater. Caleb's heart slammed against his ribs. He dug faster, widening the hole until he could see darkness below. "Can you hear me?" he called. "Yes," a voice croaked. "Who is that?" "Caleb," he said. "I live up on the ridge." There was a pause. "The boy with the strange house?" "Yes." A weak laugh drifted up. "Figures." Smoke had nowhere to go. The fire inside had died hours ago. The people inside were sitting in cold, stale air, waiting. Caleb lowered one of the blankets down through the hole and tied the bread to the rope. "Eat," he said. "Wrap up. I'm going to make an air hole bigger." He worked until his hands went numb, carving a channel so fresh air could flow. Then he tied a knot in the rope and moved on. House by house, chimney by chimney, he found them. Some had 2 people inside. Some had 5. One had a woman alone with a child who wouldn't stop crying because the cold had gotten into her bones. Caleb spoke through holes in the snow, his voice hoarse from shouting. "Stay awake. Keep moving. Follow the rope." He showed them how to crawl out through the openings he made, how to tie themselves to the line that led back toward the ridge. The snow didn't feel like ground anymore. It felt like a roof over a buried world. The wind returned in short bursts, slapping him sideways. His legs shook from effort. His fingers burned even inside his gloves. By the time he reached the 3rd house, his breath came in ragged pulls. He tied 2 people together and guided them toward the rope path. They moved like ghosts, slow and unsteady, faces gray with cold and fear. "Where are you taking us?" one man asked. "To my house," Caleb said. "It's warm." They stared at him like he was talking about a dream. When he reached the edge of the ridge again, he could barely lift his feet. Anna was waiting at the window. She saw the first shapes coming behind him and clapped a hand over her mouth. Caleb climbed up and pushed open the window. The people followed, crawling inside like creatures pulled from the ground. The animal house filled first. Bodies, breath, steam. Anna handed out blankets. She poured warm water into cups with shaking hands. "Sit here," she told them. "Close to the goats. Don't sleep yet." They obeyed her without arguing. Caleb leaned against the wall, dizzy. His vision narrowed and came back. "You came back," Anna said, her voice breaking. "I said I would try." He didn't rest. After the first group warmed, he went out again. The rope cut into his waist. The wind tore at his scarf. Snow stung his eyes. He found more chimneys, more voices. One man grabbed his arm when he came through the hole. "We laughed at you," he said. "I remember. I'm sorry." Caleb pulled him up anyway. By the time the storm finally began to loosen its grip, the animal house and the living house were full. People lay on hay. Children slept under piles of blankets. The goats stood pressed against the wall, patient and warm. Anna moved among them like she belonged there, offering bread, checking faces, speaking softly. Caleb collapsed beside the hearth at last, his muscles trembling. Outside, Pine Hollow was still buried. Inside, the strange split house was no longer strange at all. It had become the only place where life still breathed. By the time the wind finally slowed, Caleb's strange double house no longer felt like a house at all. It felt like a heart. The animal building was packed with bodies and breath. Steam rose from damp coats and blankets, clinging to the low ceiling. Goats shifted in their pen, patient and wide-eyed, their warmth spreading outward in a way no stove ever could. The living house held the children, the elderly, and anyone whose legs shook too badly to stay upright. The narrow hallway between them pulsed with movement, people passing cups of water, pieces of bread, and words that sounded like prayers. Caleb tried to sleep. His body dropped onto the floor near the hearth and refused to move again. His muscles twitched as if they still thought he was walking on rooftops. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw chimneys and white fields and hands reaching up through snow. Anna knelt beside him with a tin cup. "Drink," she said. He tried to sit up and nearly fell back down. "Slow," she warned, just like he had warned others. He drank. The water was warm and tasted faintly of smoke. It felt like it reached places in him the cold hadn't. Around them, people whispered, "That's him, the boy from the ridge, the one with the split house." A man whose beard was stiff with frost came over and stood awkwardly near the fire. "I thought you were wasting wood," he said. I said it out loud, too. Caleb didn't answer. The man swallowed. "You weren't." Caleb looked up at him. "Sit down," he said. "You'll fall." The man did. That was how it went. Apologies came in broken pieces. Some were loud. Some stayed quiet and heavy behind eyes that wouldn't meet his. Anna moved among the children, wrapping them in spare blankets and feeding them pieces of bread soaked in warm water. She had tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and her face looked older than it had a week ago. One small boy wouldn't stop shivering. Anna crouched in front of him. "Put your hands here," she said, guiding them toward the goat pen wall where the heat pressed through the boards. "Feel that?" He nodded. "That's living," she said. "It doesn't quit." The storm still raged outside, but inside the double house time shifted. It wasn't measured in hours anymore. It was measured in breathing, in cups emptied, in how long the fire stayed steady. Caleb woke later to the sound of coughing. A woman lay near the doorway, her chest moving fast and shallow. Snow had filled her house so completely that smoke had nowhere to go. Her lungs burned from bad air and cold. Caleb crawled to her side. "Sit her up," he told two men. They did. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and handed her water. "Slow," he said again. "Slow breaths." She clutched the cup like it might vanish. "I didn't think anyone would come," she whispered. Caleb closed his eyes for a second. "I did." Words spread from mouth to mouth in the low light. He went out. He found us. "Follow the rope." The ridge house is warm. The storm weakened by degrees, not by mercy. Snow still fell, but without the same fury. The wind stepped back, like it had done enough damage and wanted to watch. When the light outside changed from gray to something closer to silver, Caleb went to the upper window again. The town was no longer invisible. Roofs had begun to show through the snowpack like dark islands. Fence posts leaned out of the white. A church steeple cut through the surface at an angle, like a finger pointing up. Pine Hollow looked like a place that had drowned and been pulled back out. Caleb sat with his back to the wall and slid down until he was on the floor again. Anna came and sat beside him. "They're still alive," she said, not asking. "Yes." "Most of them?" "Yes." She let out a breath she'd been holding for days. Then the house worked. He looked around at the packed room, at the animals pressed close to people, at the hallway where warmth moved like a shared pulse. "It did," he said. The house had been built for two people. Now it held a town. People took turns feeding the goats and chickens. Others cut bread into smaller pieces so it would go farther. Someone found a harmonica in a pocket and played a thin, crooked tune that made a few kids smile. No one complained about the smell. No one laughed at the design. The man who had once called it the two-headed cabin sat with his head bowed near the wall. "I thought you were scared of the cold," he said quietly to Caleb. "I am," Caleb replied. "That's not what I mean." Caleb understood anyway. By the second day inside the house, the storm loosened enough that Caleb could step outside again without being thrown sideways. He tied the rope back around his waist and went down to the edge of town with two men who insisted on helping. They dug open doors and windows. They carried out frozen food and broken tools. They marked houses where no one answered. Not all of Pine Hollow had been saved. Caleb didn't speak when he saw those places. He just kept digging where he could. By nightfall, more people moved back into their own homes. They carried heat with them, embers in pots, blankets from the Ridge house, and a new way of thinking. When they came back to the double house, they looked at it differently. Not like something strange, like something that had known the future before they did. A woman stood in the hallway and ran her hand along the wall between the two buildings. "You built this like a bridge," she said. Caleb shook his head. "I built it like a spine." She smiled sadly. "Same thing, maybe." Anna listened to that and thought about it. That night, when most of the town had moved back down, only a few remained, those whose houses were too damaged or whose legs were too weak. The double house felt quieter, but not empty. Caleb sat by the hearth with Anna. "You saved them," she said. "We saved them," he corrected. She shook her head. "You walked out there." He stared at the fire. "I didn't walk out to be brave. I walked out because I couldn't stay." Anna leaned against him. For the first time since the storm had begun, the wind outside didn't sound angry. It sounded tired. Pine Hollow still lay buried in places, but it was breathing again. And everyone knew why. They had laughed at the split house. Now they spoke of it like a landmark. The house on the ridge. The warm house. The place where winter broke. Caleb listened to those words from the edge of the room and felt something inside him shift. He had built the house to survive. He hadn't known it would teach a town how to do the same. The storm had not taken everything. It had left behind something new. And it wasn't finished yet. Spring didn't arrive all at once in Pine Hollow. It came in pieces. First, the wind lost its bite. Then the snow softened into a heavy slush that slid off roofs in long sighs. The creek cracked open with a sound like distant thunder. And one morning, the ridge showed brown again. Just a thin line of earth pushing through the white. Caleb stood outside the double house and felt the sun on his face for the first time in weeks. It didn't feel warm yet. Not really, but it felt honest. The kind of light that meant winter had finally loosened its grip. Below him, the town looked different. Some roofs sagged. A few barns had collapsed completely. Fence lines leaned at odd angles, half buried like forgotten bones. But smoke rose from chimneys again. Doors opened. Voices traveled across the valley without being swallowed by wind. People were alive, and they remembered why. They came up the ridge in small groups at first, bringing tools, boards, sacks of grain, jars of preserved fruit that had somehow survived. They didn't come to take shelter anymore. They came to look, to measure, to understand. A carpenter named Willard knelt in the hallway between the two buildings and pressed his palm to the wall. "So the heat moves through here," he said. Caleb nodded. "It doesn't escape, it shares." Willard let out a low whistle. "That's smarter than a single big room." A woman from the edge of town studied the animal house roof. "Low and tight," she said. "Snow can't get a grip." Anna watched them with quiet pride. She swept the floor while they talked, as if the house were a guest and she was keeping it presentable. Over the next weeks, the sound of hammers returned to Pine Hollow, but not the way it used to. People didn't rebuild the same houses. They built different ones. 2 small buildings instead of one big one. Covered walkways instead of open doors. Roofs angled just enough to let snow slide off instead of settle in. Barns closer to homes. Chimneys straighter and better braced. They didn't call it copying. They called it learning. One afternoon, as Caleb helped raise a new wall near the church, a man beside him said, "Funny thing is, we thought you were scared of winter." Caleb wiped his brow. "I am." The man laughed. "Turns out that's why you beat it." Not everyone had survived the storm. Pine Hollow held a quiet service when the ground thawed enough to dig. Names were spoken. Hats were removed. The wind stayed still, as if it knew better than to interrupt. Afterward, people lingered by the Ridge house longer than they used to. Some brought their children and pointed at the 2 buildings. "That's where we waited out the storm," they said. "That's where the goats kept us warm. That's where the boy walked out into the snow." Caleb never corrected them when they called him brave. He didn't feel brave. He felt changed. The nights grew shorter. The fire burned lower. The animal house emptied as people returned to their own rebuilt homes. The hallway went quiet again. One evening, Caleb and Anna sat on the front step of the living house, watching the last of the snow melt into dark patches of earth. "It's too quiet now," Anna said. It's supposed to be, he replied. She leaned against his shoulder. Do you think they'll forget? Forget what? What the house did. He thought about that. Maybe, but they won't forget how it worked. That was the part that mattered. The storm had done more than bury a town. It had changed the way people thought about shelter. Before they had trusted walls and luck. Now they trusted design and preparation. Before they had built for comfort. Now they built for survival. Caleb didn't talk much about the winter anymore. But sometimes when the sky darkened early or the wind rose too fast, people glanced toward the ridge, toward the double house, the strange house, the house that had been laughed at, the house that had held a town together when everything else disappeared. One afternoon in late spring, Anna brought him a board with something scratched into it. What's that? He asked. She smiled. I made a sign. It read, Ridge House, built for winter. He laughed softly. That's not very fancy. It doesn't need to be, she said. It just needs to be true. They nailed it beside the hallway door. Years later, people would still come up the ridge and run their hands along the walls, curious about the strange design. They would hear the story of the storm, of the rooftops, of the rope in the snow. And someone would always say the same thing. Funny how the thing everyone laughed at turned out to be the thing that saved them. Caleb grew taller, stronger. His hands never lost the habit of building. Anna learned how to patch roofs and stack stone and read the sky. The double house stayed where it was. Two small buildings joined by a narrow spine of wood and warmth. It was never the biggest house in Pine Hollow, but it was the one that changed everything. Sometimes late at night, Caleb would sit by the hearth and listen to the quiet. Not the dangerous quiet of buried snow, but the peaceful kind. The kind that meant people were safe in their beds. And he would think about how close it all came to ending differently. Not because of the storm, but because of the way people had chosen to build. So here's the question for you. If you had lived in Pine Hollow, would you have laughed at the strange split house on the ridge? Or would you have built one like it before the storm ever came? And if winter were coming to your town tomorrow, would your home be ready? Stories like this remind us that survival isn't just about strength. It's about thinking ahead, about listening when something feels wrong, about being willing to look strange today so you can be alive tomorrow. If you enjoyed this story of courage, design, and quiet heroism, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We share powerful stories of survival and human resilience every week. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Caleb's place?